Anybody that played video games, even casually in the 90s, knows the name Final Fantasy. Standing at the top of the mountain are two games that need no introduction, those games being Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII. Today on Canon Fodder, we will analyze the events and characters in order to hindcast the Final Fantasy VI Logical Prequel. Let's begin. When this game was released in 1994, it was arguably at the height of 2D perfection. The game was long, the characters were many, the game worlds both huge. For many, myself included, the game was perfect. Time and reflection have revealed the game's flaws, but overall, it stood head and shoulders above its competition, except for maybe Chrono Trigger. The recent Pixel remasters have rekindled interest in these 2D retro games. While most fans are aware of the sequels and spin-offs for Final Fantasy VII, only hardcore fans are aware of the Final Fantasy V media sequel called The Legend of the Crystals, released also in 1994. Previous 2D games received game sequels later on, like Final Fantasy II Dawn of Souls and Final Fantasy IV Interlude and The After Years. When the series entered the third dimension, Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XIII both received additional numbered sequels. So it's kind of strange that Final Fantasy VI never received any additional content. In previous Final Fantasy games, the events preceding the main story were threadbare, for the most part, usually involving the Warriors of Light and elemental crystals destined to restore balance and peace to the world. True to form, Final Fantasy VI also opens with some brief flavor text which yada-yadas the history of the world and mentions the War of the Magi some 1,000 years ago. What sets this game apart from the previous 2D entries is the rich tapestry of side character stories that intersect with those of the main party. There is Banon, the resistant leader that becomes a controllable party member. There are Terra's parents, Maduin the Esper, and Madeline, a human woman. We see a family struggle between Sabin's teacher, Duncan, and his son Vargas, not to mention Biggs and Wedge in Magitech armor, 11 Muggles, and several ghosts that join the party for a short time. Not to be left out, the villains also receive their fair share of backstory and character exploration. We learn some brief history of Emperor Gestalt and the consolidation of his empire. We learn about General Leo and actually get to control him in a battle against Kefka. Speaking of, the main standout of the villainous cohort is, of course, Kefka. After completing the game, there isn't much narrative room for a compelling sequel. When Kefka is defeated, magic disappears from the world. Without magic, you can't really have a Final Fantasy game. Other Final Fantasy games did have time travel, but it was always accomplished by using magic, so no back-in-time shenanigans for this game. The story of Final Fantasy VI was the first in the series to include a playable flashback sequence, that being for Terra's parents. Not to mention that almost every party member has nuanced past motivations, shown in cutscenes and story arcs that are explored by the close of the game. Earlier games simply chose to disclose the heroes' backstories, if they had any, with a wall of text. Some backstories in Final Fantasy VI are important to the main narrative, while other characters and stories are hidden and can be missed. Shadow has several dream flashbacks that can only be viewed by sleeping at inns multiple times. In the world of Ruin, the player can choose to face Kefka with only Celes, Edgar, and Setzer, without reacquiring the other characters. In its own way, Final Fantasy VI was living in the past as much as in the present when telling its story. With all the breadcrumbs and stints playing side characters, the game was insisting that the player should invest in these secondary characters also. The game tells us that Kefka wasn't always evil, but that he changed after his infusion of magic. Another consideration is that unlike the villains of the previous Final Fantasy games and those that came after, Kefka won. He became the god of magic and laid waste to everything. The heroes did not save the world. At the final confrontation, Kefka is not at peace with all his power. He still wants to see the world burn. After the heroes defeat him, and he crumbles into dust. Surprisingly, he says nothing. He does not promise to return for revenge or defiantly rail against his fate. Throughout the game, we see him characterized as a cackling clown, yet the silent acceptance of his own death speaks volumes. He can only find peace in oblivion. There is a rich story screaming to be told. Kefka isn't a mustache-twirling villain, doing evil for evil's sake. Clearly, a Final Fantasy VI prequel should tell the origin story of Kefka. His humble beginnings, his awakening to magic, his descent into madness, his ascension to godhood, and finally, his defeat. We have only the barest details for his history, so we need to fill in some blanks here for Kefka. But before we do that, we need to establish the backdrop that this prequel story will take place in. The heroes of the main game have a problematic age range from 10 years old up to 70, so finding a place in history to tell Kefka's story without encountering the main heroes is hard, but not impossible. Kefka's story should logically begin 20 years ago during Gestalt's expansion wars. This setting and time frame would introduce us to the 15-year-old version of Kefka. At this stage of his life, he would still be a soldier in Gestalt's war machine. Now, another character detail that doesn't make any sense is the listed age of General Leo. During the events of the main game, Kefka's age is listed as 35, while General Leo is supposedly just 30. For starters, Leo's artwork makes him look older than just 30. Also, his bearing and level-headedness always suggested to me that he was older than Kefka based on their interactions. I always pictured Leo as being a contemporary of Cyan. I don't do fanfiction on this channel, however I intend to make a suggestion later on. Another detail that stands out to me is how Madeline found the Esper realm and why she collapsed at the gate. Final Fantasy VI made a huge deal about the Espers, and yet we don't get to see very much of them. Keeping the details minimal adds to the mystique, sure, but the Espers should have a bigger role in a prequel. I don't see why a prequel wouldn't have Madeline as a main party member and the Esper realm as a main town. So alongside Madeline, who else would we see in a prequel? Madeline definitely needs more fleshing out from a story perspective. Logically, we need to explore characters from Final Fantasy VI that were introduced to us during the main game. In no particular order, the complete list would be Kefka, General Leo, Madeline, Maduin, Duncan, and Bannon. I want to tackle some housekeeping items before launching into my hindcast. Other details to be fleshed out are the special abilities that aren't conventional spell magic, like Bannon's health ability or General Leo's shock ability. On the subject of Bannon, since he is the leader of the Returners, I submit that he is originally from Doma. Cyan's sword techniques are called Bushido, which is based on Shinto teachings. Although Doma Castle is modeled in the medieval European style, the theme of Doma is very Eastern in flavor, and Cyan is listed as a samurai. If we allow that Bannon hails from Doma, then it is likely he is a Shinto priest or shaman. Shinto priests pray to kami, which are the spirits, phenomena, or holy powers that are venerated in the religion of Shinto. Bannon's occupation in Final Fantasy VI is listed as an oracle, which by definition is a priest. When Bannon prays for healing, it is very possible that his request is being made to the Warring Triad. Every other spell in the game needs to be learned from equipped magicite or equipment. On the floating continent, we see Kefka telling the Warring Triad to strike Gestalt with lightning. The statues seem to oblige him and kill the Emperor. Without any additional lore, we can only assume that the Warring Triad is sentient enough to respond to spoken requests. A rebuttal could be that Kefka was close to them by proximity, and that's why they responded. Since we don't know for sure either way, I submit this as my evidence for the origin of Bannon's power. Before the poisoning of Doma, Kefka says to General Leo, "We need not spare these lands that gave rise to the Returners." And since Bannon is the leader of the Returners, I see no reason why my assertion isn't true. Now on to General Leo and his shock ability. The main game tells us that he refused a Magitech infusion, so I think his shock ability is generated by his crystal sword. The game describes shock as a magical attack that hits all enemies. When Leo performs shock, he swings his sword around. Maybe the sword collects static charge from the air and then releases a piezoelectric shock that is amplified by magic. The main party finds items, weapons, and armors that have magical effects, so there is a precedent for this. As for Duncan, Sabin's mentor, I see no reason to overcomplicate his origin. He is from South Figaro and is a monk, with all the same abilities as Sabin. With the bits and bobs addressed, let's move on to the prequel. I think that opening the prequel in the imperial capital of Vector is the most logical place to find a young Kefka. The action begins with General Leo and Kefka in battle against some monsters. I position Leo at the age of 25 and Kefka at age 15, and I'll explain why later on. Kefka is wearing a standard soldier uniform and attacks using a sword. Leo continues to defend while Kefka attacks the monsters, but he is doing very little damage. Kefka is on the verge of collapse after a powerful hit from a creature. Leo finally acts and defeats the monsters with a 4-hit sword combination followed by his shock ability. From the balcony above, Gestalt watches the training below. Leo encourages Kefka to look for enemy weak points. A weary but thoughtful Kefka walks to the side of the training arena and sits down to rest. Above, Gestalt remarks to Leo that Kefka may not be cut out for the sword. Leo responds that Kefka has a sharp mind, but that his talents are not suitable for straightforward combat. The Emperor informs Leo that he and Kefka must visit the towns around Vector. There are rumors of dissent that must be investigated and stopped. Master Duncan enters the throne room of Castle Figaro and bows to the king and queen. The king thanks Duncan for arriving with haste and tells him of reports concerning Emperor Gestalt. The king commands Duncan to bring a message to the King of Doma with utmost secrecy. In the town of Albrook, Madeline works as a dancing girl. The town is occupied by Gestalian forces. She has developed roguelike skills and collects money on the side by finding lost things. She has learned that the auction house in Jador has a rare and expensive treasure. The trip will be long and dangerous. She decides to hire some muscle. Maduin is an Esper warrior mage that longs to see the human world. The elders have warned him that humans are deceitful, and that he must hide his Esper identity. The elder tells him that humans will hunt him down if they find out that he can use magic. Maduin uses magic to transform into a human disguise and promises not to perform magic around humans. Maduin, now in human form, leaves the Esper realm and heads for the closest human town, Albrook. The Oracle Bannon is troubled by visions of impending war. His daily ritual halts as he hears the voices of the warring triad. He feels that the gods are calling to him, urging him to make a pilgrimage to the south. Master Duncan travels through the mountains on foot from Figaro Castle to the port city of South Figaro. There he boards a ship and sails to Doma. When he arrives, he immediately goes to deliver the message to the King of Doma. To the right of the king stands a stern, mustachioed man equipped with a curved sword. On the king's left is a robed man with a concerned visage. Both men examine Duncan intently. Duncan relinquishes the message scroll to Bannon, who in turn hands it to his king. After reading the message, the King of Doma tells Duncan that the King of Figaro has asked Doma for existence. The city-states in the southern continent have all pledged allegiance to Gestalt. The King of Doma orders Bannon to accompany Duncan on his journey to Thamasa to see if Gestalt's influence has reached that far. Maduin enters the tavern and is taken aback by what he sees. Drinking and gambling, loud music, lewd women, all the things the elder told him of. Madeline spots Maduin immediately and sizes him up in a Zozo minute. She sees his innocence and judgmental looks as he takes in the scene around him. He is large and well-muscled. He can probably hold his own in a fight, she muses. It is a good thing that she is dressed for traveling. She approaches Maduin and sits at his table. She asks him if he can help her. She tells him that letters have stopped arriving from her sister in Jador, and she is worried. The gullible oaf agrees to travel with her and keep her safe. From this point on, we would follow the three duets as they traverse the world. We'd see the gradual breakdown between Kefka and Leo, the love story unfold between Madeline and Madeline, and the reawakening of magic as we follow Bannon and Duncan. At this point I'll stop with my hindcasting, as the video is getting quite long. If there is any interest from my subscribers to continue the prequel story prediction, please let me know, and I'll publish a part 2. I think a story like this could be told in the film or video game medium. Now for some suggestions. Gestahl seems to give Kefka a broad latitude when it comes to his conduct. The game insists that Kefka is a court mage or jester due to his makeup and costume. In medieval and Renaissance times, only the court jester could insult the king. Jesters were often tasked with delivering bad news, as the levity would ease the reception. Kefka seems to be the right hand of Gestahl, as well as the jester, mage, and advisor, having the ear of the emperor, but I suggest that the connection might be even deeper. Kefka was an orphan, taken into the Gestahlian military at an early age. We don't learn of Gestahl having any heirs. I think it's highly likely that Kefka is actually Gestahl's son. Going further, I think Celes is also Gestahl's daughter. The evidence for this is found on the floating continent. Gestahl says to Celes, "You and Kefka were given life to serve me." These words alone are not a smoking gun as such. After all, given life could mean given magic power, or they were created in a lab, referring to their magitech infusion. But the next quote is not as easy to dismiss, when Gestahl continues to say, "It is your birthright to rule the world with me." Again, the "your birthright" could be directed at both Kefka and Celes, or maybe just Celes alone. However, after Gestahl is struck down by the statues, he says to Kefka, "There'll be no one to worship us." Then Kefka pushes Gestahl off the floating continent to his death, presumably. These three quotes, all taken together, should erase any doubt that Kefka and Celes are Gestahl's children. Someone might say, yeah, but Kefka and Celes have their own last names. But this can be attributed to their mothers. Case in point, Terra has the last name Branford. When we do finally meet Espers, they only seem to have a single name, so Branford must be Madeline's last name. Maybe in the world of Final Fantasy VI, the family name is passed down through the mother. At least in the case of Kefka and Celes, I suggest that this is what happened in order to keep their connection to Gestahl a secret. My last suggestion is out of left field. That's why I consigned it to the end of the video. I can't accept that General Leo was ever younger or subordinate to Kefka. Without going into a convoluted scenario, I'll simply submit that General Leo was turned to stone after the events of the Logical Prequel. The most straightforward way for this to happen is from a monster attack. The Ahriman monster, among others, has an ability that can petrify a party member if it is successful. Among General Leo's equipment, his relics are the Atlas Armlet and the Master Scroll. Neither grants any protection against the petrify status. This condition essentially puts the character into suspended animation. We have seen this happen to characters in Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy IX, so there is a precedent for this also. I think this would occur while General Leo was traveling and Kefka wasn't present. Finally, I'll say that General Leo was found and restored by Gestahlian soldiers, maybe Biggs and Wedge, 5 years before the events of the main game. Well, those are my findings and suggestions for a Final Fantasy VI Logical Prequel. If you enjoyed my video, please subscribe to the channel and comment below. I'm open to suggestions for other properties to analyze and forecast, so if you have any in mind, please let me know. Until next time.